Heino Eriksson couldn't feel his feet. His boots had long since rotted off somewhere in the Tunisian sand. Now, barefoot and half-starved, he shuffled forward with a line of prisoners, every step a surge of pain. He had been a proud Wehrmacht private, once part of the Afrika Korps under Field Marshal Rommel. But in May 1943, over 275,000 Axis troops surrendered to Allied forces in North Africa. It was one of the largest mass surrenders in modern military history. Heino was now one of 425,000 POWs the United States would bring to its own soil. As US, trucks pulled up to haul the prisoners away. One GI with a southern drawl shouted, "Hey Krauts, anybody want a ride?" Most POWs flinched, expecting beatings or worse. But Heino looked up, squinting in the sunlight. The soldier wasn't sneering. He was smiling. Heino limped forward. "Yes," he croaked. "Please." Instead of a rifle butt, he was offered a cigarette. That moment stuck in his brain like shrapnel. "I expected hatred," he would later write. "What I got was hospitality." The POWs were packed onto ships and sent across the Atlantic, unsure if they'd end up in prison camps or labor camps. Many believed they'd be sent to their deaths. But what waited for them in America was something no one Allied or Axis could have predicted. In the heart of Texas, Heino arrived at Camp Hearn, one of over 500 branch camps built across 46 U.S. states. Camp Hearn alone sprawled across 715 acres, housing nearly 3,000 German prisoners behind double-layered barbed wire. But the real shock wasn't the size. It was what was inside. There were heated barracks, running water, medical tents, and a mess hall that smelled of real bread and boiled beef. Each man was issued clean clothing, soap, and a toothbrush, luxuries many hadn't seen in years. Heino hadn't brushed his teeth since Sicily. Then came the food. Thick stew, buttered potatoes, and unbelievably apple pie. POWs ate 3,000 calories a day, nearly double what German civilians received in 1944. Heino's body, once whittled down to 128 pounds, would eventually recover to 185 during his time in captivity. The Geneva Conventions required decent treatment of POWs. America didn't just comply, it over-delivered. US camps even held cultural events, like theatre nights and orchestra concerts, often run by the prisoners themselves. German plays were performed weekly. GIs watched and clapped. In one such play, Heino played the role of a frustrated farmer, delivering his lines in thick Saxon dialect. After the performance, guards passed cigarettes and Hershey bars to the cast. "We were enemies," Heino later wrote, "but they fed us like friends." American guards weren't saints, but they were trained to follow rules, and more often than not they did more than that. One US sergeant at Hearn took off his jacket and handed it to a shivering POW during a cold front. When asked why, he shrugged. "The boy looked like he needed it more than me." The German POWs couldn't believe it. "This is not what they told us," one prisoner wrote. "We were taught the Americans were barbarians, but they are kind." That kindness became psychological warfare. Inside Camp Hearn, prisoners began questioning the Nazi cause. How could a country so rich in resources, so organized in war, be so decent to its enemies? Propaganda told them Americans were corrupt and cruel, but the reality, hot meals, fair pay, and respect shattered that illusion. Some even refused repatriation after the war. Others, like Heino, returned to America to become citizens. He would later raise a family in Texas, join a church, and advocate for peace. His sons trained as U.S. soldiers on the same base where their father was once confined. Heino wasn't an outlier. By 1946, over 20,000 former Axis POWs had requested to return to the United States. Many cited one reason: how they were treated during the war. Heino's story opens a window into one of the most unexpected and inspiring chapters of World War II. It's a story not of guns or tanks, but of dignity. Of how America showed the world what power really looked like, not just through bombs, but through bread, books, and kindness. And for those who thought America's might ended at the front lines, they had no idea what was coming next. It started with a forkful of mashed potatoes. The German prisoners at Camp Herne stared at the tray in disbelief. Real butter, soft rolls, slices of roast beef so tender they fell apart with a spoon. For many, it was the first full meal they'd had in years. One POW whispered, "They're feeding us better than our own army ever did." Another murmured, "Better than my mother could." Across the Atlantic, Berliners were boiling wallpaper for soup. In 1944, the average German civilian received only 1,500 calories per day, barely enough to survive. Meanwhile, the US Prime Sauve to Partide War Department mandated that all Axis POWs in American camps receive the same 3,000-calorie daily rations as American soldiers. Even when food was rationed at home, Americans shared abundance with their enemies. At Camp Herne, the results were visible within weeks. German prisoners who had arrived, gaunt and grey, began to fill out. Cheeks plumped, eyes brightened. Some gained as much as 40 pounds within 2 months. We weren't just surviving, Heino Eriksson remembered. We were thriving. The meals weren't always fancy, but they were consistent meatloaf, boiled potatoes, corn, stews thick with beans and beef. On Sundays, dessert arrived, apple pie, or the mythical ice cream. "It was vanilla," said one POW. "I had never tasted anything so soft, so cold, so sweet," I cried. It wasn't just the quantity, it was the dignity. POWs were allowed to sit and eat with utensils at proper tables. No shouting, no guards hovering with bayonets. One former SS corporal confessed in a letter, "In Germany, we ate standing up from tin bowls in the mud. In America, they give us tablecloths." That generosity had an impact far deeper than calories. It cracked the propaganda every German soldier had swallowed. Back home, they were told the Americans were monsters, violent, godless, greedy. But how could that be true when they were handed fresh eggs and coffee every morning? One German officer at Camp Herne, Dietrich, began keeping a diary. "I do not understand it," he wrote. "They win the battles, they take us prisoner, and then they feed us like guests." He went on, "The strength of this country, it is not only in its weapons, it is in its spirit." American guards noticed the shift. Fewer confrontations, more cooperation. Some POWs volunteered to help in the kitchen or fields. Others organized classes, math, English, agriculture. In one camp, prisoners requested typewriters so they could write memoirs. The request was approved. But not everyone was pleased. Nazi loyalists within the camps viewed this hospitality as a threat. "You're becoming soft," one man shouted at his barrack mate. "They are poisoning your mind," the accused prisoner replied. "They gave me medicine when I was sick. What did you ever give me?" Outside the wire, locals were baffled too. Some questioned why taxpayer dollars were being spent on enemy soldiers. The War Department responded with clarity. "Our strength is our humanity. How we treat the defeated says who we are." And the world took notice. Red Cross inspections consistently ranked US POW camps above any others in the war. German POWs wrote home asking family members to surrender if captured. "Pray for the Americans," they'd say. "You want to be taken by them." One prisoner, Friedrich, wrote to his wife in Dresden, "You will not believe this, but we get butter, real butter. They serve us cabbage soup with sausage. We play chess in the evenings. And yesterday, I saw a movie. It wasn't a fluke, it was policy. The Geneva Convention had set the bar, America raised it. Not just to show compassion, but to win hearts, even among enemies. By the end of 1944, German POWs were writing thousands of letters praising their captors. Some letters were intercepted and used in Allied psychological operations. Leaflets dropped behind enemy lines read, "Surrender, the Americans will feed you. They will treat you as men." One officer back in Berlin exploded with rage. "They are losing the war, one meal at a time," he screamed. He was right. Because in those kitchens, across 155 main and 511 branch camps, America wasn't just feeding prisoners, it was starving fascism, one forkful at a time. It was a Saturday night in Camp Hearn, Texas, and the barracks were buzzing. Inside the wire, the German prisoners had transformed an empty mess hall into a makeshift theater. On stage, Private Otto Hahn, once a radio technician for the Wehrmacht, now wore a tattered trench coat and exaggerated moustache. The comedy skit, written by the POWs themselves, poked fun at army life. The American guards packed the front rows, roaring with laughter as Otto shouted in mock despair, "Even the potatoes in Texas have more freedom than we did." After the final bow, something extraordinary happened. The guards stood up, not just clapping, but whistling, cheering, and tossing candy bars onto the stage. One even tossed a bottle of Coca-Cola. "Curtain call, Otto!" someone shouted. Otto grinned. "I was ready for bullets," he said later. "I got applause and soda." Camp Hearn wasn't unique. Across the US, POW camps didn't just house enemy soldiers. They allowed them to write plays, form jazz bands, paint murals, publish newspapers, and even hold philosophical debates. It was an explosion of culture and humanity inside barbed wire, a world apart from the horror many of these men had come from. Inside Hearn, one of the largest POW camps in the US, prisoners published their own camp newspaper in German. It featured editorials, poems, and news clippings. They also formed choirs, orchestra groups, and theatre companies. Some performances included multiple costume changes, painted backdrops, and handcrafted props funded by modest stipends earned through agricultural labour. The performances weren't always light-hearted. One camp staged Goethe's Faust, another reenacted scenes from Les Miserables. Still others presented plays banned in Nazi Germany, like Bertolt Brecht's Life of Galileo. "In America, we could perform truths we were never allowed to speak," Otto said. "Even in captivity, we were freer than back home." American commanders encouraged it. They believed culture could be a weapon against fascism. "Give a man a book, a stage, or a musical instrument," one officer said, "and you hand him a mirror." Many POWs began seeing that mirror and didn't like the reflection of what they had once served. But these cultural freedoms weren't just psychological tools, they were signals of America's unmatched capacity. While German factories were being flattened by Allied bombs and civilians foraged for firewood, America was giving pianos and typewriters to its prisoners. That's not a moral gesture, it's a demonstration of overwhelming strength. Heino Eriksson, observing a rehearsal one afternoon, was struck by the normalcy. "It was like being in university again," he wrote. "And yet we were prisoners of war." He described the smell of sawdust from the stage, the off-key tuning of a camp violin, the way one guard tapped his foot to the rhythm. They weren't just tolerating us, they were enjoying this too. Of course, not all German POWs welcomed it. The Nazi hardliners, nicknamed the Blacks, believed this artistic outpouring was a betrayal. They attempted to intimidate those who participated in plays or band performances. In some camps, these loyalists slashed paintings and destroyed instruments, but the tide was against them. One former U-boat officer named Ludwig tried to shut down a performance by tearing up the script the night before. The cast rewrote it from memory and added a satirical scene mocking Ludwig's temper. When the play was performed, even the guards got the joke. "The loudest applause," Heino said, "was for the part that mocked the Nazis. That's when Ludwig knew he'd lost. Because what America was doing night after night, joke after joke, was more powerful than prison bars. They were proving that culture, creativity, and compassion couldn't be bombed or silenced. That freedom wasn't just something Americans fought for, it was something they lived even with their enemies. By 1945, several POWs were requesting to stage American plays. One group performed Our Town by Thornton Wilder, learning the English lines phonetically. After the final curtain, a guard walked backstage and said, "You boys did better than some stateside troops." Otto Hahn later wrote, "They came with rifles, but they conquered us with laughter." And while the rest of the world was collapsing, inside these camps, something was being built: respect, identity, and, in many cases, a longing to be part of what their captors stood for. It started with a play. It ended with a prisoner asking, "How do I become one of you?" The beating started just after lights out. Wooden chair, legs, fists, and boots came down hard on the young man's ribs. His name was Hugo Kraus, and his crime wasn't betrayal. It was speaking English too fluently. He had grown up in New York before the war, a German-American caught between two nations. When he was drafted into the German army during a family visit to Bremen in 1939, Hugo had no choice. But in Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, surrounded by hardline Nazi POWs, his accent and his refusal to join their loyalty groups made him a target. He was found the next morning, bloodied and broken, his sewing machine destroyed. Hugo had used it to tailor uniforms for fellow prisoners. The guards rushed him to the infirmary, but he died hours later. He was 24 years old. News of Hugo's murder shook the entire U.S. POW camp system. The War Department had known that Nazi loyalists nicknamed the Blacks were trying to maintain discipline and ideology behind the wire. But Hugo's death made it undeniable. There was a war inside the camps. How do you protect men from their own side? American commanders responded fast. Investigations launched. Surveillance increased. In Tonkawa, a dozen prisoners were transferred out. New segregation camps were created specifically for the most radical Nazis. Some were moved to Camp Alva, a high-security installation in Oklahoma with armed towers and strict curfews. Others were placed in isolation. But something else changed too. The American strategy began to shift from simply housing POWs to re-educating them. The Office of War Information quietly supplied books, newspapers, and newsreels to the camps. Captured Germans were shown footage of liberated concentration camps. Some refused to believe it, others wept. At Camp Papago Park in Arizona, guards initiated daily discussions with POWs about democracy, freedom of speech, and religious tolerance. The goal wasn't forced conversion, it was exposure. "We're not brainwashing them," one officer said. "We're just letting the truth breathe." The truth hit hard. One prisoner, formerly an SS sergeant, confessed to his chaplain, "My enemy gave me more respect in a week than the Reich did in a decade." Heino Eriksson recalled that after Hugo's death, the mood changed permanently. "The fear broke," he wrote. "We knew who the real enemy was, and it wasn't America." In some camps, POWs formed anti-Nazi clubs, quietly sharing forbidden newspapers or listening to Allied broadcasts on smuggled radios. They began writing essays, crafting petitions, requesting more English lessons. By 1945, over 137,000 German POWs had participated in voluntary educational programs inside U.S. camps. They studied American history, democracy, ethics, and most tellingly English. But even as minds changed, Hugo's death left a scar. The guards at Tonkawa conducted a full military funeral for him. He was buried with a hand-sewn flag, crafted by fellow POWs who had once mocked him but now mourned him. An honor guard fired 3 volleys. American and German prisoners alike saluted in silence. A chaplain gave the eulogy. He wanted no more than to be left in peace. He found peace, at last, in the land of his birth, under the stars and stripes. What Hugo's murder proved was chilling but also revealing. Even in captivity, surrounded by ideological enemies, the values of openness and kindness had begun to break through. It terrified the Nazi loyalists, but it inspired the rest, and America didn't stop there. New protocols were implemented. Any prisoner caught threatening or assaulting another could be relocated instantly. Guards received specialized training in recognizing signs of fascist organizing. Chaplains, counselors, and psychologists were embedded in larger camps. The goal wasn't revenge, it was prevention and progress. The war within the wire was being won, not with bullets, but with books, with decency, with rules that held even in the chaos of global war. One POW later wrote in his diary, "The Nazis could not silence us with terror, but America gave us the words we never had the courage to speak." And those words were only beginning to echo. In 1952, a man stood quietly outside a small white chapel in Houston, Texas. He was holding a hymnal, not a rifle. Wearing a pressed shirt and borrowed tie, he waited for his sons to finish Sunday school. His name was Heino Eriksson. Just a few years earlier, he had been a prisoner of war in Texas, captured as a young German soldier, shipped across the Atlantic, and held in Camp Hearn. Now, he was a free man, a U.S. citizen, a father, and a pacifist. His journey wasn't just personal. It was proof that America had done the unthinkable. It had converted an enemy soldier into a defender of American values. Heino wasn't alone. By the end of the 1,940 seconds, more than 20,000 former German POWs had applied for U.S. citizenship. Many returned not out of economic desperation, but because of the way they were treated during captivity. In interviews, they used words like respect, opportunity, honor, words they never expected to say about the country that once bombed their cities. While Nazi propaganda painted Americans as cruel, Heino found the opposite. They didn't have to treat us well, he said. But they did, and that is what broke me and rebuilt me. At Camp Hearn, Heino had worked in the camp office, thanks to his fluency in English. He typed rosters, filed documents, and managed supplies. His supervisor, a sergeant from Chicago, once told him, "I don't care if you wore grey or green, you do your job well, and you'll be treated like a man." That sentence hit harder than any weapon. In his free time, Heino studied American government, borrowed history books from the camp library, and even led group discussions on the U.S. Constitution. He was fascinated that a country at war could still allow its citizens to criticize their leaders without punishment. In Germany, he wrote, our silence was survival. In America, speaking freely is a right. After the war ended, Heino was repatriated to Germany, but something felt wrong. Bombed-out cities, shortages, bitterness. He tried to resume civilian life, but the seed planted in Texas had grown too strong. In 1950, using a contact from the camp, he applied for a sponsor in the U.S. Through the Displaced Persons Act, he returned legally to Texas. This time there were no fences, no guards. Just open roads and open arms. Heino settled in Houston, found work in a warehouse, and later as a translator. He married a local schoolteacher, adopted orphaned children from war-torn Europe, and joined the Religious Society of Friends, also known as the Quakers. The man who once marched under a swastika now preached peace under a cross. His sons would later enlist in the U.S. military, training on bases like Fort Knox and Lackland, places where their father had once been held as a prisoner. It wasn't irony, it was legacy, and Heino wasn't the only one to walk this path. Former POWs like Werner Glaser, once a tank mechanic in the Afrika Korps, settled in Nebraska and became a farmer. Kurt Fuchel, who spent time in Camp Aliceville, Alabama, opened a bakery in New Jersey and donated bread daily to veterans' homes. These men didn't just come back, they gave back. Their reasons were consistent. The treatment they received as prisoners shattered everything they had been taught. They came expecting punishment. What they found was potential. One former POW wrote, "America defeated us, not just with firepower, but with fairness. The ripple effect extended beyond individuals." Some German communities, skeptical of Allied nations, softened after hearing first-hand accounts from returning POWs. American values began to take root in unlikely soil, carried home not by bombs or broadcasts, but by men who had once stood on the other side. In many cases, it wasn't politics that changed minds, it was simple things. A clean uniform, a hot meal, a kind word from a guard. Small acts that, repeated daily, built something stronger than any propaganda. Trust. By the 1,960 seconds, former German POWs who had become citizens were voting, raising families, and even serving in local government. They were no longer the enemy, they were Americans, and their transformation wasn't an accident. It was designed intentionally and proudly by a nation that believed even its enemies could become its future. Heino's story is the story of how America, at the height of global conflict, didn't just defeat fascism with bullets. It offered a better alternative and dared its enemies to choose it. Many did. And in doing so, they became some of the most patriotic Americans of all. The first spoonful nearly stopped his heart. Cold, soft, and unbelievably sweet, it melted instantly on his tongue. "Vanilla," whispered Franz Becker, a former artillery gunner captured in Tunisia. Real ice cream. He had never tasted it before. The last dessert he remembered was wartime ration bread soaked in beet juice. Now, sitting under the Texas sun behind barbed wire, he was eating ice cream served by the very army that had defeated him. That simple treat was not a fluke. During World War II, the United States produced 135 million pounds of powdered ice cream not just for GIs on the front, but also for enemy prisoners of war. The dessert became a quiet but devastating weapon. For soldiers like Franz, it wasn't just a taste of America, it was a taste of something his country could never offer: abundance. In Camp McAllister, Oklahoma, ice cream was served once a week in the mess hall. Prisoners lined up in silence, gripping their metal trays like children at recess. When the dessert ladled into their bowls, the room lit up. Some cheered, some cried. "We had lost the war," one POW said later, "but we had won dessert." Why would a nation feed ice cream to its enemies? Because America could. And that ability, the power to care, even in conflict, was part of what made the US unbeatable. The Germans called it overwhelming material superiority. But it was more than machines. It was a culture of generosity backed by a war engine no other nation could rival. The numbers told the story. While Europe starved, the US produced over 90 billion pounds of food during the war. The War Food Administration ensured that American troops, allies, and even enemy captives were fed well. When rations were low in some Allied countries, German POWs in the US were still served meals that met Geneva Convention standards, sometimes exceeding what Allied civilians received in Europe. The psychological impact was enormous. Men who had grown up hearing that Americans were brutal capitalists were now savoring chocolate milk and peach cobbler. "They conquered us," Franz wrote in his journal, "and then they fed us like kings." In Camp Huntsville, Texas, one GI guard recounted how he snuck extra ice cream to a group of older German soldiers. "They reminded me of my dad," he said. "Tired, thin, beaten, they just wanted something sweet." That gesture spread. Guards started using their own money to buy treats for prisoners. Red Cross parcels often included jam, coffee, and yes, more powdered ice cream. And the POWs, in turn, began asking questions. "How can a country feed its enemies this way?" one asked. The answer was in the numbers. US farmers were producing 40% more than in peacetime, and American factories could supply both the front lines and the camps without breaking stride. But ice cream wasn't just food. It was a symbol of normalcy, of joy, of something worth living for. In German camps, prisoners ate in silence, often with sticks and tin bowls. In America, they ate sitting down, with real utensils, and sometimes even music playing in the background. Franz remembered one Sunday vividly. A prisoner strummed a guitar in the corner, while others hummed along to a slow German folk song. The guards didn't stop them. They listened. Then one American stood and sang a few lines of "Home on the Range." Everyone laughed. The prisoners clapped. That night, Franz couldn't sleep. He had dreamed of ice cream melting in his hand and waking up in his mother's kitchen. But it wasn't his mother's kitchen. It was America. And it felt more like home than anything he'd known in years. There were critics, of course. Some civilians wrote angry letters to their congressman. Why feed the enemy ice cream when our own boys are dying overseas? The War Department's answer was clear, because how we treat our enemies defines who we are. Because kindness was another front in the war. And it was working. By late 1945, the Red Cross reported that German POWs held in America had higher morale, better physical health, and lower incidents of violence than any other captives in the world. Ice cream played its part. It didn't just satisfy hunger, it melted resistance. When Franz was repatriated to Germany, he packed a notebook filled with English phrases, recipes he had copied from camp cooks, and a single word scribbled on the last page: "Thank you." He would later tell his children, "The best thing I ever tasted in my life was American ice cream, because it came with dignity." That's what made America different. It didn't just defeat enemies, it changed them, one scoop at a time. It began with a book, tattered, soft-bound, its spine nearly broken from use. A German POW named Karl Mayr flipped through the pages in disbelief. It was the Federalist Papers translated into German. Sitting at a wooden desk in Camp Concordia, Kansas, he read about a republic built on freedom of speech, divided powers, and individual rights. He looked around. Barbed wire, armed guards, a world away from liberty. Yet here he was, learning about American democracy from the very people who had captured him. Camp Concordia wasn't a prison. It was becoming a classroom. By 1945, the U.S. Army had launched one of the most ambitious educational programs ever seen in wartime, re-educating enemy prisoners through books, lectures, and debate. More than 137,000 German POWs participated in classes across 160 main and branch camps. They studied English, math, geography, political philosophy, even the American legal system. And they weren't forced. They volunteered. The Geneva Conventions required humane treatment. But America went far beyond that. In Camp Papago Park, Arizona, prisoners read Mark Twain and Shakespeare. In Camp Campbell, Kentucky, some POWs learned American civics and how elections worked. One German officer confessed, "I had to be captured to read a banned book." In some camps, American teachers were brought in to lead structured lessons. Former college professors and high school instructors, many of them veterans, taught night classes for enemy troops. Classrooms were stocked with chalkboards, desks, and borrowed books from local libraries. One camp even offered correspondence courses with the University of Kansas. Karl Mayr enrolled in every class he could, English lessons in the morning, world history in the afternoon, and at night, quiet hours in the barracks reading under a dim lamp. His favourite was Thomas Paine's Common Sense. "I had never been told," he later said, "that government could serve the people. It wasn't just books, it was an environment. Camp newspapers were allowed written, edited and published by POWs. At Camp Alva, prisoners debated democracy versus fascism in formal forums. These discussions were monitored but not censored. We didn't tell them what to think," one US officer explained. "We just showed them that thinking was allowed." For many, it was their first brush with unrestricted thought. In Nazi Germany, deviation from ideology meant prison or worse. But in these camps, men could disagree, argue, question authority and not be punished. That alone changed lives. The Germans began changing each other. Hardline Nazi prisoners, still loyal to Hitler, were isolated, in special high-security camps. The rest began to drift. Some stopped saluting. Others folded their swastika armbands away for good. As one former tank officer wrote, "America gave us pens when we expected chains. Not everyone welcomed the transformation." In Camp Ruston, Louisiana, a pro-Nazi prisoner tore down a poster advertising English classes and scrawled "traitors" across the blackboard. The next morning, the entire classroom had returned and brought 2 new students. It was working, and America knew it. While other nations locked POWs in cold barracks with little to do, the US offered them a future. Not because it had to, but because it could. The same industrial machine that built Liberty ships and Sherman tanks also printed textbooks and shipped dictionaries to enemy camps. The numbers were staggering. By 1946, US camps had distributed over 1 million books, including German-language editions of the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, and American novels. Some prisoners wrote essays praising the concept of peaceful protest. Others began writing to their families back home, urging them to read banned literature if they could get their hands on it. When Karl Mayr was finally released and sent back to Bavaria, he took 3 things with him: a hand-copied English dictionary, a letter from his American teacher, and a new worldview. He would later become a schoolteacher himself, using the same books he first encountered behind barbed wire. He called his camp experience the most important education of my life, because while other nations tried to break their enemies, America taught them, and in doing so, it created not just witnesses but believers. ChatGPT said, The snow came early that winter in Kentucky. A bitter wind cut across the flatlands, sweeping through the rows of wooden barracks at Camp Campbell. German POWs stood stiff in their coats, arms wrapped around themselves for warmth. One, a teenager named Dieter Cole, had come from North Africa wearing only thin desert fatigues. Now he was shivering so hard his knees knocked. An American sergeant named George Donnelly noticed the boy shaking, took off his own army-issue wool jacket, and draped it over Dieter's shoulders without saying a word. That moment became a legend inside the camp, not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. It was quiet, human, and unexpected. "I thought he was going to yell at me," Dieter said years later. Instead, he gave me his coat. No words, just warmth. These small acts of compassion happened all across America's POW camps. While the world was torn apart by brutality, the United States, despite being at war, built a reputation for decency that astonished both friend and foe. That generosity wasn't just emotional, it was institutional. US military policy dictated that all POWs receive adequate shelter, heating, medical care, and winter clothing, even if it had to be taken from domestic stockpiles. At Camp Campbell and hundreds of other camps, German prisoners were issued heavy coats, gloves, and wool blankets. If they didn't have proper shoes, they were given boots. When they fell ill, they were treated in on-site hospitals, some staffed by US doctors, others by fellow German POW medics using American supplies. Dieter, who had lost a toe to frostbite in Tunisia, was treated by an American nurse who offered him socks hand-knit by church volunteers. "I was the enemy," he recalled, "but they cared for me like I was family." These weren't just isolated stories. Red Cross inspections and army reports documented thousands of such encounters. America didn't see generosity as weakness. It saw it as proof of strength. A powerful nation didn't need to torture or starve its enemies. It could overwhelm them with dignity. The contrast couldn't have been starker. German camps for Allied POWs were often cold, filthy, and undersupplied. Thousands of American soldiers froze or starved in Stalag camps across Europe. At Stalag Luft III, made famous by the Great Escape, American airmen rationed stale bread and soup with worms in it. At Camp Campbell, German POWs were given 3 full meals a day, access to showers, and weekly laundry. Even prisoners couldn't believe it. "America didn't just win the war with tanks," said Helmut Vogel, another POW from the same camp. "They won it with blankets, with shoes, with warmth." The effects were powerful. Many POWs began helping out voluntarily, chopping wood, assisting in hospitals, teaching fellow prisoners. Some even knitted scarves for wounded Allied soldiers. "We wanted to give something back," Dieter said, "because we had been given more than we deserved." The guards, too, changed. For some, it was their first close contact with Germans. At first, they were wary, expecting aggression, hate, resistance. But what they found were young men, often scared and hungry, who responded to kindness with respect. Bonds formed. Nicknames were exchanged. At Christmas, some guards and prisoners sang carols together through the fence. One American chaplain remembered bringing a Bible to a German POW who had requested it. "He cried when I handed it to him," the chaplain said, "not because he missed God, but because someone had listened." These weren't just moments of mercy, they were strategic. The US government knew that how it treated its prisoners would ripple out across the world. Letters from POWs were monitored, translated, and sometimes even used in leaflets dropped over enemy lines. "The Americans will treat you well. Lay down your arms." It worked. Surrender rates increased. Morale among Axis troops dropped. And in the long run, thousands of POWs returned to Germany carrying a secret weapon. Admiration for the enemy they once feared. Dieter returned to Stuttgart in 1946, wearing the same US Army coat Sergeant Donnelly had given him. He kept it for decades. In 1972, he visited Kentucky with his family. He stood in front of the old gate at Camp Campbell, now a quiet training ground, and said to his son, "This is where I learned the meaning of strength, not from violence, but from kindness in a storm." It started with whispers in the barracks. "Did you hear? They're lying to us." The Americans made it up. That can't be true, can it? The rumor had spread like wildfire. Someone had seen photographs of a concentration camp in a U.S. newspaper, smuggled into the compound at Camp Aliceville, Alabama. The images were brutal corpses stacked like firewood, gas chambers, starving survivors. The Nazi loyalists inside the camp called it propaganda, but others, especially the younger POWs, couldn't look away. Then the guards did something no one expected. They handed out more newspapers. In camp after camp, American guards distributed bilingual news bulletins, real Allied reports, unedited, untranslated alongside German-language papers that included excerpts from Life, the New York Times, and Stars and Stripes. These weren't just headlines about the war, they were truth bombs. Full articles about death camps, Hitler's orders, the fate of Jews and dissidents. The goal wasn't humiliation. It was revelation. And it worked. In Camp Rupert, Idaho, a POW named Ernst Hoffman, a former tank mechanic, wrote in his diary, "I stared at the photos for hours. I was sick. I wanted to believe it was fake, but I could not. Something inside me cracked." The power of those images, combined with the freedom to read and question, sparked a quiet revolution behind the wire. While Nazi loyalists tried to suppress the material, American guards simply kept it coming. They made it impossible to look away. "You may not like what's written," said one camp officer, "but here in America, you are free to read it." No other country dared take this approach. In Soviet camps, information was withheld. In British camps, control was strict. But in the United States, prisoners were handed the tools to undo their own indoctrination: books, essays, magazines, and above all, evidence. The results were profound. At Camp Trinidad, Colorado, several POWs began meeting secretly to discuss what they were reading. They called themselves Ander and the Others. Within weeks, they had formed a study group, reading American political philosophy and writing letters home, urging family members to question what they'd been told. Some even began reporting Nazi sympathizers to camp authorities. One of them, a young man named Rudy Schaefer, wrote a letter that would later be translated by army censors. "They told us the Americans had no soul. But I see more soul in their newspapers than I ever saw in the Reich speeches." Of course, there was backlash. In Camp Como, Mississippi, a Nazi loyalist attacked a fellow POW for posting a newspaper clipping on the barrack wall. The guards intervened, removed the instigator, and doubled the newspaper distribution the next morning. The Americans weren't just allowing truth to circulate, they were weaponizing transparency. It was a tactic as radical as it was effective. The US believed that truth unfiltered, unforced, was a force more powerful than ideology. And in the minds of many POWs, that truth hit harder than any artillery shell. By 1945, nearly half of all POWs surveyed in American camps reported a significant change in their political beliefs. Thousands rejected Nazism. Some began writing essays praising democracy. Others quietly converted to Christianity or started asking questions about how to emigrate after the war. And America didn't just let them think. It encouraged it. Some camps held formal debates. One group argued the merits of free elections versus the Führerprinzip, the Nazi concept of a single, unquestioned leader. The pro-democracy side won by a landslide. The judge? An American officer who reminded them, "You just did something not allowed in the country you once served." Even German officers began to break ranks. At Camp Huntsville, a lieutenant who had once ordered men into combat against USS forces stood up during a debate and said, "I no longer believe we were fighting for truth, only for control." By war's end, the mental surrender inside US POW camps was nearly complete. Men who had once shouted, "Sieg Heil," were now asking about the Bill of Rights. Some requested English Bibles, others drafted thank you notes to the guards who treated them as men, not monsters. It was more than winning hearts, it was dismantling hate. One POW summed it up best. "They didn't shout at us, they showed us, and that is why they won. Because America didn't just drop bombs. It dropped facts, and nothing shook the enemy more than the freedom to read them. The wire was there, the guards were armed, the watchtowers stood tall under the Texas Sunday, but no one ran. Across 155 main camps and more than 500 branch camps, the United States held 425,000 Axis POWs, and yet there were almost no mass escape attempts. Just a handful of scattered breakouts, most of which ended within days. The reason wasn't tighter security. It was something far more powerful. The prisoners didn't want to leave. At Camp Herne, one German corporal named Friedrich Keller was asked by a new arrival why no one had tried tunneling out. He laughed. "Tunnel to where?" he said. "To war? To starvation? This is the best I've lived in years." He wasn't joking. Inside the wire, men had warm beds, clean clothes, 3 full meals a day, and for those who wanted it, books, sports, music, and even jobs with pay. Compare that to the broken cities of Germany, where civilians were digging through rubble and rationing potato peels. Or the Eastern Front, where captured Germans were dying by the thousands in Soviet labor camps. In America, escape wasn't just dangerous, it was irrational. The numbers made it undeniable. The largest escape effort, known as the Great Papago Escape, occurred in December 1944 when 25 German POWs tunneled out of Camp Papago Park in Arizona. Most were recaptured within days. One surrendered after getting lost in the desert and asking a farmer for directions. Another returned voluntarily, saying, "I was hungry and I missed the food." The US military took these moments seriously, but also saw the deeper message. If men would rather stay in custody than run toward their homeland, something was working. That something was more than comfort. It was structure, opportunity, and human dignity. Every day, prisoners could sign up for work assignments, picking cotton in Texas, harvesting sugar beets in Nebraska, or repairing roads in the Midwest. They were paid 80 cents per day, which they could use at the camp canteen to buy soap, postcards, candy, and cigarettes. It wasn't slavery. It was economy. And it gave prisoners purpose. Guards observed it firsthand. In Camp Ruston, Louisiana, a young GI named Jack Monroe wrote to his mother, "These Germans are working harder than some of the locals, and they say thank you when they get their wages." Recreation was just as important. Camp Herne hosted full-scale soccer tournaments. At Camp Butner in North Carolina, prisoners staged operas and built model airplanes. In Montana, some took up painting and submitted their work to local art shows. Americans allowed it not out of softness, but because it kept the men sharp, busy, and thinking about something other than escape. It was a kind of warfare America had mastered fighting ideology with experience. When you feed a man, educate him, treat him fairly, and give him something to lose, he stops trying to run. Even the guards noticed. Sergeant Howard Colson, stationed at Camp Fort Riley, said, "These men could walk out if they wanted, but they don't." And that says more about America than any barbed wire ever could. What few escapes did happen were usually the work of die-hard Nazis clinging to the illusion of honor. One pair made it to Chicago before being captured. Another tried floating down the Mississippi on a homemade raft, only to be picked up by fishermen and handed over with a free meal. The POWs often joked about it themselves. "Why dig a tunnel?" one prisoner asked, "when you've got bread, books, and baseball?" There's power in that question, because behind it lies the core of what made America different. Where other nations enforced captivity through fear, America created contentment. It didn't break prisoners. It made them feel human again. And in that humanity, resistance collapsed. When repatriation began in 1945, thousands of German prisoners asked to stay longer. Some even volunteered to help dismantle the very camps they had lived in. "This place," one said, "was the first time I was ever treated as a man and not a number." The barbed wire was real. The guard towers were real. But the most secure prison America ever built didn't need a wall. It needed only a warm meal, a book, and a little decency. And that, more than rifles, tanks, or steel, kept 425,000 men from ever trying to run. The camp mess hall smelled like fresh stew and baked bread. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen Texas plains. But inside Camp Herne, German prisoners sat at long wooden tables, eating full plates of food, meat, potatoes, cabbage, rolls slathered with butter. Some even had dessert. Meanwhile, in Berlin, civilians were boiling wallpaper to extract glue for soup. In 1945, the contrast between victor and vanquished wasn't just written in battle reports, it was etched in the dinner menu. At Camp Herne, every prisoner received 3 meals a day, totaling over 3,000 calories, the same ration allotted to American GIs. Red Cross inspections confirmed it. "These men are not merely surviving," one inspector wrote. "They are thriving." While German civilians back home received as little as 1,200 calories per day rationed, and often mouldy America was feeding its enemies more than some of its allies could afford to eat. And the prisoners knew it. Hans Richter, once a proud Panzer crewman, couldn't believe it. His first meal at Herne included beef stew, green beans, white bread, and butter. "Real butter," he told a fellow inmate, holding up the golden slab as if it were treasure. "In Hamburg, my mother waits in line for hours for margarine made from coal oil. And here, they give us this?" He wasn't exaggerating. In Germany, food was scarce, and the war had turned even basics into luxuries. Bread was stretched with sawdust. Meat was almost non-existent. Butter was reserved for party officials and black market barons. Children fainted in schools. But in American camps, prisoners were gaining weight. Some added 15 to 40 pounds in just 2 months. Camp Herne's kitchen used real ingredients: flour, eggs, milk, vegetables from nearby farms. POWs often worked in those very fields. And when they returned to camp, they ate the same crops they had helped harvest. "They made us feel useful," one prisoner said, "not broken. This wasn't charity, it was a calculated decision." America knew the war was being watched not just by its citizens, but by the world. By treating POWs humanely, even generously, the US sent a message: "We win through strength, not cruelty." And that message echoed. Some POWs wrote letters home begging their families to surrender if captured. "Try to be taken by Americans," one letter read. "They will not starve you, they will not beat you, they will feed you like a friend." Those letters were intercepted, translated, and dropped behind enemy lines as propaganda leaflets. And they worked. In Camp Concordia, Kansas, prisoners even ran a canteen stocked with snacks, coffee, chocolate, and cigarettes, all bought with wages they earned doing agricultural work. The shelves were better stocked than stores in war-torn Frankfurt. American guards took notice too. Sergeant Bill Adams recalled sharing his lunch with a young prisoner during guard duty. "He looked at my sandwich like it was gold," Adams said. "I had 2, so I gave him 1. He almost cried." These weren't isolated moments. They were part of the daily rhythm of camp life. Men once taught to see Americans as devils were now laughing, eating, and playing chess with their captors. The transformation was slow but steady. Meals became meetings. Bread became trust. And it all came back to the food. By the end of the war, many German POWs had grown healthier in captivity than they had ever been in combat. Their teeth were repaired, their wounds treated. Their bodies filled out with muscle instead of malnutrition. The American prison system had fed them better than their own army ever could. When Hans Richter was released and sent back to Germany, he stepped off the train with a satchel of Red Cross rations and a folded American flag he had received as a farewell gift. "I came to America as a soldier," he said. "I left as a man who knew what dignity looked like. Berlin was rubble, cities were ash. But in the camps of Kansas, Texas, and beyond, something extraordinary had happened. America had proven that power didn't require brutality. It required belief in the idea that even an enemy deserved a full plate, a warm bed, and a chance to change. And in that belief, America didn't just feed bodies, it fed hope. The man who stepped onto the VFW stage in Waco, Texas, had white hair, a slight limp, and a German accent softened by decades of English. He adjusted the microphone and cleared his throat. "My name is Heino Eriksson," he began. "I came to this country as your prisoner, but I stand here today as your fellow citizen." The crowd of veterans fell silent. Some knew his story, Most didn't. But by the time he finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Heino wasn't alone. By the early 1952, thousands of former German POWs who had been held in the United States during World War II had returned not as enemies, but as immigrants. Over 20,000 Axis prisoners applied to become American citizens. Many were approved. They bought farms, opened shops, married locals, raised children. Some even joined the US. Military. The country that had captured them had also converted them. The transformation wasn't a fluke. It was the direct result of how America chose to fight and how it chose to win. From the moment the first German prisoners arrived in camps like Herne, Aliceville, and Concordia, they were treated not with vengeance, but with principle. They were fed, clothed, educated, and most shockingly respected. It wasn't out of weakness. It was a show of strength. America didn't need to brutalize its enemies to prove its superiority. It simply was superior, and it proved it every single day behind barbed wire. When the war ended, many POWs returned home to devastation. Cities destroyed. Economies collapsed. Governments in shambles. But in their memories was a strange contradiction. Their best meals, their cleanest clothes, their first taste of freedom had come from their former enemy. Some couldn't let go of that. Heino was one of them. After returning to Germany in 1946, he couldn't shake the sense that the future wasn't behind him, it was across the ocean. In 1950, with the help of a sponsor and under the Displaced Persons Act, he returned to Texas. He took a job as a translator, later became a Quaker, and adopted children orphaned by the war. His sons grew up saluting the same flag that once flew over his prison yard. Heino wasn't just a story of redemption. He was a mirror of what America stood for. So were the others. Like Karl Weber, once a Luftwaffe pilot who became a mechanic in Iowa and helped build tractors for American farmers. Or Rolf Zimmermann, a former infantryman who opened a bakery in Michigan and gave away loaves every Veterans Day. These men didn't forget their pasts, but they chose their future. Why? Because America offered it. Because in the darkest days of war, the United States made an impossible bet that it could defeat hate not just with bombs, but with books, not just with tanks, but with trust, not just with force, but with freedom. And the gamble paid off. By 1955, many US towns that once hosted POW camps now counted former prisoners among their residents. Churches welcomed them. Businesses hired them. Communities embraced them. Even former guards came to see them as friends. At a reunion in Alabama, a retired GI hugged the man he once watched behind a rifle. "We were soldiers," he said, "but you were human, and America never forgot that." In return, these men became quiet ambassadors carrying stories back to Europe of what America really was. Not the caricature painted by Nazi propaganda, not the empire of greed their officers warned about, but a country of structure, of justice, of overwhelming compassion backed by overwhelming power. And the numbers told the rest of the story. 425,000 Axis POWs, 0 mass revolts, near zero escapes, tens of thousands requesting to return. No other nation on earth could say the same. Not because they couldn't feed their prisoners, but because they couldn't imagine doing so. America imagined it, then it did it, better than anyone, on a scale the world had never seen. And in doing so, it turned enemies into believers. That was the final victory, not won on the beaches of Normandy or the ruins of Berlin, but inside the fences of places like Camp Herne, where a bowl of soup, a clean cot, and a second chance spoke louder than any gun, where strength was measured not just by firepower but by how gently it could be wielded, and where the most powerful force America ever deployed wasn't its military, it was its values.